Good afternoon, everyone, and we hope you enjoyed the morning session of the NJDOT Research Showcase, and thank you for joining our breakout session this afternoon, which will be on energy and electrification as it relates to smart transportation. My name is Ryan Stacey, and I am the PR assistant at Rutgers Center for Advanced Infrastructure and Transportation, and I'll be your moderator this afternoon. We have two presentations set up for you, which we will get to in a moment, but first, a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you should see a Q&A box where you can submit any questions as I come up for our speakers. And after each presentation, we will answer these questions in our allotted Q&A time. Also, following both presentations, we will open the floor again for additional Q&A with all of our speakers. This session is being recorded and will be available soon after the event at the NJDOT Technology Transfer website. Additionally, certificates for those eligible to receive professional development hour credits will also be mailed to you soon after the event today. With that, I would like to begin introducing our first speaker, Laura Soares, who will be sharing her research on energy harvesting evaluation of photovoltaic noise barriers on highways. Give me 1 second to share my screen here. So Laura is a PhD candidate in the Graduate School of Engineering at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, where she graduated with her master's degree in October of 2020. She obtained her BS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of Campinas in Brazil, and Laura performs research under her advisor, Dr. Hao Wang, from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Rutgers. Her motivation and interests lie in preparing transportation infrastructure for the future by using innovative and sustainable solutions, identifying new technologies with potential benefit to the transportation sector, and analyzing their enviroeconomic impact. Recently, she has focused on wireless charging technologies for electric vehicles and harvesting energy from highways, more specifically, using photovoltaic noise barriers. So thank you, Laura, for presenting today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ryan. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Soares. I'm a PhD student at Rutgers University, and with my professor and advisor, Dr. Hao Wang, we developed this project, also with the help with some New Jersey DOT team. So today I'm going to talk about energy harvesting evaluation of photovoltaic noise barrier on highways. Next, please. So as a background, this topic is important now, specifically nowadays, because government and government agencies are putting more effort to decrease pollution. And even the president has called for 100% of the national electricity to come from carbon pollution-free source by 2035. And Secretary of Energy said that 40% of the nation's electricity can come from solar energy. However, regular solar farm requires a lot of land, and to provide 100% of the nation's electricity, we will need a land bigger than Netherlands, just for solar industry alone. So using infrastructure that either already exists or has a second purpose for also harvest solar energy could be a good solution for this issue in terms of saving land. Next, please. And one of the solutions is using noise barrier as also a source for harvesting solar energy with the photovoltaic noise barriers, or PVNB, how I'm going to call during the presentation. So these infrastructures already exist. It has a purpose of reducing noise from traffic on highways and can also be used to install solar system on it. And this helps to save land because the infrastructure is already there. In densely populated areas where noise barriers is more required is also where there's less available space for implementing ground-mounted solar panels. So combining these two technologies is a great idea to use infrastructure that is already there for another purpose as well. Next, please. So the objective and goal of this project was to evaluate the potential energy of PV&B in New Jersey. So retrofitting the already existed noise barrier. And for that, the first step that we did was to understand and study the PV&B configurations. There are different types of configurations that can be implemented. And the second step was to do a case study into specific noise barriers in New Jersey. And then the third step was to estimate the energy harvesting potential of the noise barriers in New Jersey. Next, please. So the methodology used was for the first part to understand the different configurations was to select 4 different locations in the United States with different latitude and global horizontal irradiance, and then simulate and analyze the energy performance in these different places. And then the second step was to do also using simulation 2 study case with 2 different orientation, one barrier facing south and the other one facing east-west. And then the last step was to find a polynomial equation that could describe the energy performance of different PV&B configurations to estimate the state level potential of solar energy harvesting from noise barriers. Next, please. So the first step was to choose 4 locations. The location chosen was Phoenix, Arizona, Denver, Colorado, Tampa, Florida, and Seattle, Washington. And they have very different GHI, which is the solar radiation, as well as different latitudes too. As we can see in the graph here to the bottom left, the lowest irradiation is from Seattle, followed by Denver, Tampa, and lastly with the higher global horizontal radiation is Phoenix, Arizona. Next, please. And the noise barriers configurations that was studied was these 4 configurations. These configurations are configurations that can be implemented in already existing noise barriers. So we can do some retrofitting in already constructed barriers instead of constructing from zero. And they are the first one, the tilted top mounted, where the solar panels are installed on the top of the noise barriers with some tilt to optimize the energy absorption. The second one is the bifacial top mounted, in which the solar panels are also installed on top of the barriers in a vertical position because these panels can harvest energy from both faces. Then on the built-on configurations, we have the shingles, in which the solar panels are installed on the face of the barrier, but with some tilt to optimize the absorption. And the last one is the vertical build-on, in which the solar panels are installed vertically on the face of the barrier. And for the simulation, we assume a barrier with 500-meter long and 5-meter high. And then for the build-on configurations, we assume 2 meters of free space from the ground to the lowest part of the panel. And the reason that we did that is because to avoid not avoid accidents, but to avoid more damage in case of accidents. If there's a sidewalk there, to avoid any type of vandalism on the panels, or even someone hitting their head on this panel. So that's why we left 2 meters of free space from the ground to the first to the bottom part of the solar panels. So for these configurations, we did the simulation with the barriers facing south, which the azimuth is 180 degrees, and with the barriers facing east, which with the azimuth 90 degrees. Next, please. So these were the results, and here we see the total annual energy harvesting from this design and graph on the left is facing south, and the graph on the right is facing east. And we can see that for both locations, the highest energy comes from the 3 and 4 shingles. This is very related to also the amount of panels that these designs have. They have the most number of panels on it. And however, if we see the vertical build-on, although they have the same amount of panels than the 3 shingles, the 3 shingles still have a better performance than the vertical build-on. And to understand not only the total annual energy, we also look at the energy per panel, so we can kind of understand the energy density of each configuration. So we're not biased just to the number of panels that each configuration can provide. Next, please. So in this graph, we see the energy per panel, and we can see that for barriers facing south, which is the first graph, the top mounted tilted provides more energy. This is for all locations. And for the panels facing east, the top mounted bifacial is the one that provides more energy per panel. And with this study, our conclusion was that the best configuration will vary depending on the goal of the project. If the goal of the project is to implement a more cost-benefit energy solution, maybe the best option will be the top-mounted, depending if it's facing east or south would be the tilted or the bifacial. However, in a situation where there is a limited amount of noise barrier and the goal is to harvest the most energy possible, maybe to provide energy for a rest area or for a street light, maybe the 3 shingles or 4 shingles could be the best approach for this problem. Next, please. So after this first study, we decided to do a case study in 2 different barriers in New Jersey, one facing south and the other one facing east. So the first one, which is basically facing south, is this one in Springfield in I-78 Express. The length is 493 meters and the height is approximately 17 feet, which is a little bit more than 5 meters. And for this study case, we did a simulation for top-mounted, bifacial, and shingles. Next, please. So for the top-mounted, the first step that we need to do is to find the optimum tilt, so the angle that will harvest the most energy. For that, we did a simulation with a smaller system for kilowatt system, and we found different energy outputs for different tilts, and we can find the polynomial equation that fits this graph, and with that we can find the highest the tilt for the highest energy output, and in this case it was 36.7 degrees. So we did a simulation with this tilt. We found an annual energy output of 98 megawatt hour. For the top mounted bifacial, the design is a little bit more simple. It's basically a 90 degrees panel on top of the noise barrier with harvesting with photovoltaic material on both faces of the solar panel. And then the annual energy output was 92 megawatt hour. And lastly, for the shingles, we did the 3 shingles due to the height of the barrier, and for the angles of the shingles to harvest the most amount of energy, different angles here was the best solution with 70 degrees, 65, and 40 degrees. And to find these angles, we performed several simulations, and the annual energy output was 275 megawatt hour. Next, please. So the result was what we expected due to the first analysis with the 4 different locations. So since this barrier is facing south, we did expect the highest energy per panel to be for the top mounted tilted. And as you can see here on the last column of this table, the highest energy per panel was from the top mounted tilted. followed by the bifacial, and then the three shingles. And the three shingles, as we also expected, is the configuration with the highest annual energy, which we can see on the second column of this graph. Here on the bottom row of this graph, I put the results of the shingles if the shingles had 45 degrees instead of the 70, 60, and 40, as I showed on the previous slide. And now I'm going to explain a little bit later why did I do also this analysis, but it's important to see here that the difference between the different angles and the 45 degrees angles is small, is only 5% lower. Next, please. And then for the second case study, we studied this barrier in Parsippany, New Jersey, located in I-287. It's basically facing east with an azimuth of 116 degrees. The length is almost 1 kilometer, and the height is a little bit higher than the previous noise barrier the previous barrier that we studied. So for this case, we also decided to do simulations with forest shingle as well. Next, please. So the methodology was the same. For the top mounted, we found the polynomial equation that best fitted the tilted versus annual energy output. So the tilted with the highest energy output was 25.3 degrees. And then we found the annual energy output of 181 megawatt hour. And then the top mounted bifacial, again, 90 degrees with photovoltaic material on both sides. And the annual energy output was 212 megawatt hour. Next, please. And for the 3 and 4 shingles, again, we did simulations with different angles for the shingles, and we found that the angles that harvest the most energy for 3 shingles was 10, 64, and 45 degrees. And then for 4 shingles was 10, 60, 60, and 60. So the annual energy output for 3 shingles was 477 megawatt hour, and for the 4 shingles was 618 megawatt hour. Next, please. Here again, the summary was what we expected. Since these barriers basically facing east-west, the configuration with the highest energy per panel was the bifacial, as we can see in the last column here, with 310 kilowatt hour per panel, while the configurations with total and highest total annual energy was the 3 and 4 shingles, with 4 shingles the highest one. And then here again, I put the results of the 3 shingles and 4 shingles with 45 degrees. And the reason that I did that is because, as we've seen on these 2 cases, for each different orientation, the best configurations for the shingles will vary a lot. So every different angle of orientations, the tilt of each shingle can vary. And to do a state level analysis, it would be extremely complicated to find the optimum tilt for each specific orientation. So for the next step, you can go to the next slide, please. For the next step, we did the state level estimation for the top-mounted tilted, the top-mounted bifacial, and also the built-in shingles. So for the shingles here, we assume that the shingles will have 45 degrees, all the shingles, because we saw in the previous studies that even facing east or south, the difference between the best configuration and the 45, which is a more simple configuration, is only 5%. Because it's a state level estimation, it's already a rough estimation, we assume 45 degrees for the shingles. For the top mounted, since each orientation has a different optimum tilt, we found the optimum tilt for every orientation at 20 degree range. So 10 degree, 30, 50, 70, and so on. And then we did simulations for different orientations for all these designs. And then for each one, we found the polynomial equation that best described the energy output with R squared higher than 0.9. Next, please. So this was the equations that we found that best describe the energy output for the top-mounted tilted, the top-mounted bifacial, 3 and 4 shingles. And then we apply this equation for all the existing New Jersey barriers. Next, please. So this was the result for top-mounted tilted, 27,000 megawatt hour per year, which is, it could represent lighting 1,600 miles of street lights, which represents 4.2% of New Jersey public roadways. For the top-mounted bifacial, 21,000 megawatt hour per year. The 3 shingles can produce 4,000, almost 49,000 megawatt per hour year, and for shingles 56,000 megawatt hour per year. And this could represent more than 3,000 miles of street light, which is 8.6% of New Jersey public roadways. Next, please. So with this project, first we found that projects aiming the highest energy should prioritize 3 and 4 shingles configurations. However, projects prioritizing cost benefit should prioritize top-mounted configurations, and when facing south should be the tilted, facing east-west should be the bifacial. The vertical build-on may be selected due to its aesthetics, since it's vertically implemented on the barrier. However, it's not, in terms of performance, it's not the best for the highest energy or for the highest energy density, which is energy per panel. New Jersey Noise Barrier Study Case verify what we found out in the nationwide study case, which was the 4 locations that we did previously. And also we found out that PV&B is a good solution to provide electricity without increasing the footprint. New Jersey has the potential to provide electricity for 2,300 to 6,300 houses only using solar energy for PV&B, or to avoid more than 3,000 miles of street light electricity bill. Next one, please. However, PV&B has some challenges. First, considering only the electricity benefit, the PV&B cannot fully pay for the noise barrier itself. However, when including noise reductions and greenhouse gas emissions reduction, it may be economically feasible. PV&B has some issues of over-engineering or inefficient because there's no quality or guideline standards. The inclusion of photovoltaic material does not benefit the barrier acoustically. The glassy material from the panels does not absorb the noise. It actually reflects the noise. And there's also some safety and security concerns as well. Risk related to traffic accidents, fire propagation, panel damage, panel glare, driver distraction, and even snow drift in severe weather locations. And lastly, there is an efficiency loss due to the soiling. Close to the highway, the traffic produces a lot of dust, and this can decrease the efficiency of the photovoltaic noise barrier. Next, please. So for future work, we want to develop a decision-making tool to assist in PV&B implementation. So we want to develop a tool in which you can input a barrier that you are studying to implement the photovoltaic noise barrier, and then the output will be the energy output as well as the recommendation. And we will consider the technical viability, social impact, and cost benefit analysis on this tool. And lastly, I want to say a special thank you for the New Jersey team that helped us with their expert contribution and assistance, Giri, Edward, and Pragna. That's it. Thank you very much.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for your presentation today. It was very interesting and informative, and we do now have some time for Q&A for Laura's presentation. Just want to remind everyone quickly that you should see a Q&A and chat box toward the right of your screen, I believe, and there you can submit any questions that you may have. So we'll give everyone just a couple moments to submit some questions now. So I'm not seeing any yet. One question that I had, though, maybe to kick things off, you talked at the end of your presentation, Laura, about the tool that you're working on developing now. I think that's very interesting, and we talk about like energy and electrification and so on. A lot of the conversation is, when can we expect this or that to be implementable? Can you talk maybe more about the timeline of that project and where your team is at with that?
Sure. Yes, of course. So now we have already a tool that predicts the energy output of these barriers when you input the orientation and the barrier length. However, there are other aspects when you implement some photovoltaic noise barrier. This technology is not new in the world, but it's new in the US. There's already photovoltaic noise barriers in Europe, and however, here is new. And there are other aspects that can impact the implementation that is not only the annual energy output. So, for example, depending on the traffic, maybe it's not the best option to implement this photovoltaic material on that specific road. So this is another input that is not only the annual energy output, but it can be like a social input on it, or even the acceptance from the residential population around it. Since it's a new thing, implementing this photovoltaic material in an area that is going to be more accepted, it can be a good way to implement this for future references as well. So all of this, it could be an impact of this next tool. We are in the very beginning of it, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be a good tool to help New Jersey DOT for the decision making of implementing it or not.
Excellent, thank you. And another question that we just had come in asks, aside from Massachusetts, are there other known U.S. locations that are utilizing this concept?
So Virginia has one project that they are studying. There's other locations in the U.S., for example, Florida, even New Mexico. They're doing studies of implementing solar energy on the right-of-way, not necessarily on the noise barrier, but on the space side of the highways. So I think it's a trend from now on, especially now that we have also the federal government incentivizing using solar energy and clean energy. I think we're going to see more and more other states studying and implementing this technology.
Excellent. Thank you again, Laura. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment, but as a reminder, at the end of our upcoming presentation, we will have some more time for Q&A from all of our, actually, sorry, we do have one more. This question asks, how do we safely dispose of solar panels?
So solar panels, it's a little bit problematic in terms of recycling and disposal because it does have some toxic material on it. I don't know how to tell you exactly what is the safe way to dispose the solar panel material, but this is something that we definitely need to consider when, for example, doing life cycle assessment, where we're measuring the benefits of reducing the the pollutants when we're producing the energy, but now we have a material that we need to dispose that also have some toxins. So unfortunately, I don't know how to answer this question, but this is definitely an issue when using solar panels.
All right, and thank you again, Laura. And again, I will remind everyone, the end of our next presentation and Q&A session, we'll have time for some more questions and answers with all of our panelists again. So thank you, Laura, for taking time to present today.
Thank you for the questions.
So at this point, I'm going to introduce our next speakers. We'll be moving to our second presentation, and we'll have three speakers who will be talking about the multi-state regional clean freight corridor study. And our speakers are Al Beatty. Al is a senior project manager leading the development of CALSTART's innovative mobility portfolio in the Northeast region. Al manages and supports projects ranging from transit supportive mobility hub development to policy guidance for low-impact last-mile deliveries. And prior to joining CALSTART, Al is a senior transportation planner at the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, where they focused on developing safe, accessible, and multimodal transportation networks in the greater Philadelphia region. Al holds a master's degree in urban planning from New York University and a BA in environmental studies and anthropology from Stony Brook University. They are a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. We're also joined by Leslie Fordjour. Leslie works for the New York Metropolitan Transportation Council, which is the metropolitan planning organization of New York City, Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. He currently serves as NYMTC's freight coordinator and is the project manager of NYMTC's Regional Clean Freight Corridor Study. He has experience in assisting in the creation and organization of NYMTC's Regional Transportation Plan, which is NYMTC's Long Range Transportation Plan. And lastly, we're joined by Christopher Lamm as well. Christopher is a principal of Cambridge Systematics with 15 years of experience in metropolitan and urban freight transportation planning and policy. Mr. Lamm has led freight plans and studies for state DOTs, metropolitan planning organizations, and other transportation agencies. He's led national research on urban freight and last mile delivery issues. And Mr. Lamm is the project manager for Cambridge Systematics contract with the NJDOT Bureau of Research and is the consultant project manager of NYMTC's Regional Clean Freight Corridor Study. So I will now share the presentation from our next group of speakers here. Just a second. And with that, Chris, Al, and Leslie, I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'll start off. I will take you all through the first few slides. Good afternoon, I'm Leslie Fordjour, as I've been introduced. Next slide. Seeing the gray box. Next slide, please.
Sorry, is it not showing up?
No, I'm seeing the gray box at this moment.
Let me try sharing my screen again.
Yep,
Are you
I am. Yes, now I'm seeing something.
Okay.
Thank you. So what is NIMTEC? NIMTEC is the MPO of an area that covers the 5 boroughs of New York City, that is Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx, as well as the 2 counties out in Long Island, which is Nassau and Suffolk County, and the 3 lower Hudson Valley counties of Westchester, Rockland, and Putnam. It is comprised of 9 voting members and 7 advisory members. Our 9 voting members are the following: Westchester County, Rockland County, Putnam County, Nassau County, and Suffolk County. Also, we have the New York City DOT, New York City DOT, New York State DOT, New York City Department of City Planning, and the MTA. These 9 members are voting members. Additionally, we have 7 advisory members. We have the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. We have NJ Transit. We have the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, or NJTPA, which is our sister MPO across the Hudson River. We have the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the FTA, the FHWA, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. These seven members are all advisory members, and they form basically the Council of NIMTEC. Next slide. So our study's objective is fivefold. First is to catalog existing alternative fuel infrastructure in the region. Second, analyze current and emerging cleaner fuel technologies. Third, identify gaps in both existing and future alternative fuels infrastructure. Fourth, examine goods movement and trends and forecasts. And last, identify and assess optimal corridors for clean freight corridors designation. Next slide, please. The geographic scope of the study is widespread. It's wide-ranging. So we have various MPOs involved in the study effort. The MPOs involved are the following: the 6 COGs, or Council of Governments, out in Connecticut, the Orange County Transportation Council, or the OCTC, which is our neighboring MPO to the northwest of NIMTEC, NJTPA, again, our sister MPO across the Hudson River, and the Lehigh Valley Planning Council, which is an MPO located out in eastern Pennsylvania. The geographic scope of our study ranges as far east as the Hartford metro area in Connecticut and as far west as the Lehigh Valley region out in Pennsylvania, a distance of 150 miles as the crow flies. Next slide, please. So the scope of work for this effort, this Clean Freight Corridor study effort, we have 5 tasks. Task 1 involved the formation of 2 committees, our Studies Steering Committee and our Studies Technical Advisory Committee. These committees are intended to provide valuable input to the study to help make it more accurate, to refine it, to improve the study, the quality of the work we're doing here. Tasks 2 through 5, you see here on your screen, we'll go into greater detail. With that, I'll hand off the baton to Chris Lamm.
All right, thank you, Leslie. We'll move on to the next slide, please. So adding on to Leslie's introductory remarks on the study, this study is particularly interesting and valuable because while so much of the electric charging infrastructure is focused on passenger cars, the emissions effects of trucks and the needs of the motor carrier industry are very different and warrant their own considerations and study. So we're looking at where there's need for more infrastructure and for what fuel types, and how to implement the development of that infrastructure across this large region that's in our study area. So the first of our technical tasks, task 2, included assessing the foundation of existing clean freight fueling and charging infrastructure across the region. Next slide, please. So we relied on publicly available station location data from the Department of Energy to identify where fueling stations for CNG, propane, hydrogen, and e-charging stations are located. Now, not all facilities, particularly on the e-charging station side, are available to heavy-duty vehicles, and we'll discuss how we filtered some of those in coming slides. We also included the designation status of highways in the region, including corridor pending and corridor ready designations for each fuel type from Federal Highway Administration. And this is kind of a proxy for where there's sufficient density of infrastructure that may already exist in those corridors. And then we made maps for each fuel type, including pointing out where there are gaps in existing infrastructure for each fuel type. So on the next slide, We see, for example, looking at compressed natural gas stations, there are 31 such stations potentially available to trucks in the region. On the right, the yellow buffers surround gaps where corridors are not signage ready and where there are few, if any, stations located in or near those corridors. So for CNG, most of the major highways in the region are a visible gap in existing infrastructure. On the next slide, we've done the same exercise for LPG, where there are currently or proposed a total of 40 sites in the region. And again, most of the highway network across the region is a visible gap for LPG stations. The following slide looks at hydrogen. Hydrogen is not nearly as built out as any of the others, with only one existing station in the region and only 4 proposed. So therefore, the entire major highway network in the region is a gap for hydrogen. And then finally, electric is a bit different from the others. There are well over 100, nearly 200 charging stations around the region for electric. But once we applied some filters to filter out proprietary sites, such as ones that are specifically built for Tesla and only Tesla, or other proprietary sites, ones that are not fast charging, ones with fewer than 2 fast charging dispensaries, those filters kind of brought us down to a number of 45 charging stations within the region. And even some of those may not necessarily be accessible due to, parking lot geometries or location specs that may not be able to accommodate large heavy-duty vehicles. So we see that most of the highway corridors are designated by FHWA as signage ready in the region for electric, but that's again based on access for passenger vehicles, and heavy-duty vehicles do not have access to all of those facilities. So we can't necessarily rely on those designations as much for electric because there's an incompatibility issue there with trucks. Therefore, most of the region does remain a gap for fast charging for heavy-duty vehicles. Next slide, please. So task 3 is where we're doing a little bit of a gaze into the crystal ball and trying to project out into the future the potential for adoption of alternative fuel vehicles in these motor carrier fleets. On the next slide. So that crystal ball includes a model looking at total cost of ownership under different scenarios to estimate how aggressively or not aggressively alternative fuel vehicles may penetrate into the fleets that are operating on the road. On the next slide, this is a proprietary model called the Heavy Duty Vehicle Adoption Rate Model, developed by our partner CALSTART. And it estimates the total cost of ownership for vehicles in each fuel type category, taking into account a number of different cost drivers, including purchase price, the incentives, including point of sale incentives available in each state of the study area, the costs of maintenance, the cost of insurance, title and registration, fuel economy and fuel price, and a number of other metrics. And those costs we looked at state to state because, again, some of the incentives vary state to state, insurance costs vary state to state, registration and title, all of those vary a little bit across the 4 states that are in our study area. So we did break it down by state. The model also profiles adoption by fleet owners, taking into account variations in their access to capital, their relative patience for getting payback. Some want to return very quickly, others are a little more patient, scalability and other factors that may influence the fleet owner's decision making. And then profiling the fleets themselves for turnover rate and things like that. So we've run this model with a number of different scenarios to try to anticipate how adoption may change if aspects of the total cost of ownership are higher or lower, if the fleet owners are more aggressive or conservative with their decision making, etc. So on the next slide, this shows starts showing some of the outputs of that model. So these charts show the change in total cost of ownership by fuel type, and we also broke it down by vehicle class and state from 2020 through 2050. So this estimates whether the upfront costs of acquiring alternative fuel trucks are offset by the lower operating and maintenance costs over the lifetime of the vehicle. So looking at that, there's a clear upward trend or an advantage for CNG, battery electric, and fuel cell electric over time. And the benefit is particularly large for longer haul operators. So if the cost per mile, in the O&M category is lower and you run more miles, then you kind of pile up that savings over time. So there's more savings for some of those longer haul operations than for some of the shorter haul drayage and local operations. The profile for propane is not as optimistic as it is for the other fuel types, and that's reflecting a high cost for propane fuel that's expected to persist or even increase going into the future. There's a lower, upfront cost premium for LPG, but that O&M savings over time just isn't there, and it does not pay off in the long run like the other fuel types do. On the next slide, so this looks at the adoption rate by fuel type that is projected in 3 different scenarios, 2A, 2B, and 2C. You'll see the graphs there on the slide. In all of those scenarios, and we ran this through a range of adopter types, and there are more aggressive or more kind of conservative postures toward adopting. But in all scenarios, diesel drops below 50% of new sales between 2029 and 2034. So within that 5-year window, in all scenarios, a majority, more than 50% of the trucks start to become alternative fuel sales and not diesel. So you can see that dark blue line plunging in that date range in all of the graphs. And in all scenarios, battery electric, which is the light blue line, ends up with the highest sales share, with fuel cell electric coming in second place in green. And you'll see as you look particularly at 2B and really 2C, the impact of the less aggressive or more conservative adopter profiles resulting in more volatility in sales share because they are less motivated to make the change and are likely more sensitive to changes in the federal and state incentives. So as those incentives may sunset or step down incrementally over time, you see a lot more fluctuation in the projected sales shares in response to that. And the model's anticipating a bit of an overreaction when those changes happen, and then restabilizing as those costs kind of evolve over time. So on the next slide, we've assembled some maps that represent the midpoint scenario, that 2B scenario that was on the previous slide. And the maps show how the truck stock will turn over between now and 2045. The maps show snapshots in 2045 of each of the 4 major fuel types. And here we omitted LPG because the model was not too keen on the future of total cost of ownership and adoption of that type. So we see here diesel on the left side, still having large clusters with large numbers you see in the legend of the map there. But that's because we're seeing strong diesel sales persisting into the 2030s. And many of those trucks will still remain in fleets into the 2040s. Then we see on the right CNG registrations in similar clusters, at least in their geographic positions, but in lower quantities. If you look, you'll see the smaller numbers in the legend. On the next slide, we've done the same thing for the zero emission technologies. So for hydrogen on the left there, vehicle pockets are expected to get denser over time as fuel costs come down appreciably in coming years. And the total cost of ownership based model anticipates more hydrogen vehicles as a result. Particularly, you see some darker blue colors there in central Long Island. We also see large clusters on Long Island, New York City, and northeastern New Jersey for electric there in the green on the right. And the size of the pockets for electric are larger, indicated by the numbers in the legend, than any other fuel type. So again, we're anticipating that battery electric to become dominant by this point in time, and the distribution of trucks on the map illustrate that expected outcome. On the next slide, so all this geographic analysis is captured and made available in an online mapping tool. You can visit the tool and track the study's progress, and I think we can drop a link to it in the chat here momentarily. And we have all of the geodata layers for the fuel stations, corridor designations, and so forth, all there, and you can kind of toggle through and see where different things exist in the region. So the next slide, we get into task 4, and this is where we start looking at the freight demand trends and forecasts. So how much freight is moving by truck, how is that likely to change, and maybe even change the size of the truck fleets that we're likely to see in the future. So on the next slide, we started by looking at commodity flow data from a vendor, IHS Markit, a data product called Transearch, that estimates commodity flows of commodities now and going into the future. So 88% of the freight tons in our 4-state region study area move by truck. And the total volume, measured in tons, is expected to increase 37% between 2018 and 2045. So a substantial reliance upon trucking in the region to move goods, more so than the national average. And the growth in tonnage is expected to increase as our population and economy are projected to grow into the future. On the next slide, we took these commodity flow patterns and wanted to look at the travel patterns of trucks in different highway corridors in the region. So that if we're looking at the trucks that use a certain highway, and are emitting in certain communities, what would it take to transition the fleets that are using those highway segments? So understanding the travel patterns and who's using those highways is useful for trying to wrap your head around that. So looking, for example, at I-495 on Long Island, it's the Long Island Expressway. The majority of the truck trips there are local, are within 100 miles, start to end. And 100% of them, all of them, have an origin or a destination within the study area. So in short, you don't go to Long Island unless you have to go to Long Island if you're a truck. So that suggests that these fleets, as they transition, may have fueling or charging at their home location that may satisfy their needs, or that investments in public accessible charging or fueling stations for trucks in this region could potentially be adequate for the needs of the majority of trucks that are on that highway segment. On the next slide, we can contrast that with Interstate 84 in Orange County, New York, where almost 2/3 of the truck traffic there is traveling 400 miles or more, and the vast majority of that is passing through the region. So investment in alternative fueling infrastructure here in the region can help to accommodate some of the vehicles using that highway section, but to really transition most of the fleets using that highway would depend upon partnerships with other states and regions, and really building out more infrastructure across a larger portion of the country to support that need, that demand. On the next slide, we wanted to look at some of the demand generators to help us understand some of those origin destination patterns for freight a little bit more, but also to potentially identify opportunities for partnerships with industrial real estate developers and some of these fleet owners who may have home-based charging or fueling, to identify, again, places where some of that infrastructure could potentially be developed in the future. All right, and then moving on to the next slide, I will now hand it over to Al Beatty, who will walk us through Task 5 and our recommendations. Al, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I'll be talking through Task 5, which was to assess and identify an optimal mix of new clean freight corridor designations. And this task is currently in process and is really a culmination of all of the prior tasks and the data sets that Chris just walked us through. Next slide, please. So using those inputs from previous tasks, we are thinking about where are the gaps in the existing infrastructure, where are the needs, the future demand, and from those things, what are our recommendations for a new set of clean freight corridor designations? Next slide. I'll talk a little bit about our method for developing our list of draft clean freight corridor designations that was recently presented at a stakeholder workshop for feedback. Essentially, in thinking about which segments we want to designate as clean freight corridors, we're thinking primarily about current readiness. And so we developed a readiness score for each fuel type that consists of a weighted composite score that was created in partnership with our technical advisory committee, which variables they thought would be important for trucks and what should be the relative weights of those variables. So the three variables we chose for our score were fuel station coverage, or what % of each highway segment is located within a 5-mile buffer of a fuel station for each given type. Freight demand clusters, so how close are you to freight generating uses, and then existing truck volume taken from the 2018 annual commodity truck volume. We normalized each of those variables, created a composite score, and then created 3 categories. Really were just bins of data that we labeled high, medium, or low. So this high, medium, low readiness designation is relative. It doesn't meet specific thresholds in the way that the current FHWA designations do, but it tells us what are the most developed corridors given the current landscape of the region. And so the high readiness segments we're thinking of as our designated clean freight corridors. But we also didn't want to lose sight of corridors that might currently be underdeveloped in terms of a given fuel type infrastructure, but might have a high need in the future. And so we also developed a need score. It's a little simpler. It consists of projected demand that we calculated in an earlier task and air quality. And so we combined those two things and found that segments with a low readiness currently, but a high future need could be designated as priority development corridors, since there's sort of a mismatch between where they are and where we want them to be in the future. Next slide. So there's a long list of results from this analysis that I'm not going to walk through today. So I'll just walk through compressed natural gas as an example. We ran this analysis for each of the 4 fuel types. This table shows results for compressed natural gas. Specifically, it shows those highway segments that scored as high readiness for compressed natural gas. So a lot of current fueling infrastructure for CNG now. And you'll see if you look on the right, in the very right column, we also have the CNG need in the future. And so mostly these match right now for CNG. The high readiness levels have high future need, a couple of mediums in there. Next slide. So similarly, these are those highway segments that scored low for readiness level for CNG. And like the high scorers, these are mostly matched with the future need. You see a lot of low and lows. There's one exception, which is in Suffolk County on Long Island, New York 27, which has a low current readiness, but a high future need. And so that would be an example of one that we would want to designate for development of infrastructure, even though it doesn't meet the earlier criteria I mentioned for readiness. Next slide. These maps show those same results just in visual format, and I know this is a little bit hard to see in a slide form, so these will eventually be on an interactive web map, but just to give an example. So on the left, you see compressed natural gas readiness, and on the right, you see need, where the darker segments have the highest scores for each of those. And next slide. Oh, next slide, please. This is a bivariate map that pitches those two things against each other, the need score and readiness score. So as an example, you'll see New York 27 on Long Island is a teal color, showing that it has that combination of high need and low readiness. Next slide. So I won't spend too much time on these, but you can see here we have the same maps created for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Next slide. Next slide, please. For hydrogen, next slide. And then for LPG, which as Chris mentioned, has a pretty low forecasted demand. So we don't actually have a need score developed for that since it's across the board low, but you can see readiness there. And next slide. So we also want to think not just about these designations, but looking ahead to implementation, not just where should we develop infrastructure, but how. And so a couple of really key notes on policy for this investment. Number one, you have to keep in mind that trucks are not cars. So not just any fueling station, say a charging station, to use electric as an example, is going to be useful for a heavy duty vehicle, a large tractor trailer. So in developing infrastructure for trucks in these priority corridors, you have to ensure that the physical dimensions of the sites can accommodate heavy trucks. That includes the fueling stall dimensions as well as the ingress and egress points to the site itself. And in order to do that right, it's really important to have industry input. And then similarly, everything is coordination. So you also need to coordinate with utilities to make sure that you have the appropriate fueling loads, whether it's megawatt loads for electric or natural gas distribution capacity or hydrogen fueling sites. And next slide, and I'll pass it back to Chris.
All right. Thank you, Al. So a couple of weeks ago, we convened a stakeholder workshop. So we have, over the course of the study, we've engaged a steering committee, which is NIMTIC's PFAC Freight Subcommittee. It includes a lot of the public agencies in and around the region. We have a technical advisory committee that reaches a bit outside of that to some other agencies and other stakeholder groups. But we really wanted to engage some really key stakeholders who are going to be key in the implementation of clean fueling and charging infrastructure in the region to discuss the outcomes of the study, discuss some of those preliminary recommendations, and really get their input and their perspective on recommendations on how we can implement this. So we convened a diverse group of stakeholders that have an interest in the topic. That included, some transportation planning agencies, and then also motor carriers or trucking fleets, trucking companies, fuel suppliers, We got the perspective of truck stop operators and the perspective on the fuels that they sell and what their customers' needs are, equipment manufacturers, as well as some environmental organizations, with concerns about truck emissions and so forth. So with that group, we reviewed the study goals and findings, again, got their input, and are going to be incorporating that input into the final recommendations as we are looking to wrap up the study over the next few months. And then also, wanting to promote interest among these stakeholders and among folks who they talk to in implementing clean freight technologies here in this region. So keeping it as an important issue in their minds and sending them forth into the industry. So I think it was a very effective workshop. We used breakout groups and some interesting feedback collection tools to really make sure that we were hearing perspectives from all of the participants. And then the next slide, I think I'm handing it back to Leslie to go ahead and close us out.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, comments, additional feedback, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is right there on your screen. And again, thank you for your time. So any questions, comments, or concerns? I should really say questions or comments.
Hi, Leslie, Chris, and Al. Thank you all for your presentation this afternoon. We will, again, now be taking some time for Q&A for this second presentation here. We'll give people maybe a minute or so to submit some questions in the chat box and Q&A box. And I'll also add, Chris just put in the Q&A box the link to the interactive map that was mentioned earlier in the presentation if you're interested in checking that out further as well.
Actually, it cut off part of the URL, so that is the incorrect link. I will paste in manually the full URL so that will take you to the right spot. So apologies for that.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. And maybe to get started here, while we wait for some more questions to come in, you talked about some of the, like you mentioned towards the end of the presentation, how trucks are not cars, and some of the, I guess, challenges or obstacles we need to overcome to better implement some of this EVs and clean energy and so on. And then the workshop you mentioned at the end, do you kind
You're kind of breaking up there.
Sorry?
You're breaking up a bit.
Sorry about that. I was basically asking the workshop you mentioned at the end, do you see similar ones such as those happening again? Is that kind of forward to implementing some of the findings in your study?
Yes, I think for the purpose of the study, we won't be having subsequent workshops. But the study is only taking us as far as developing the implementation guidance and recommendations. But I think as NMTIC and NMTIC's members and other agencies and stakeholders kind of take the lead on developing that implementation, that coordination and communication and all of that is going to have to continue. So I think the workshop kind of kicked off the process of bringing those stakeholders together and start these conversations. But I think as implementation proceeds, those conversations are going to have to continue and even expand to bring in some others.
Yes, right. So basically, this study is just to bring our recommendations. It isn't anything binding, for our members to use to their purposes, kind of like what Chris just said. Hopefully, you're still there. Ryan, can you hear us? I think we may have lost Ryan.
All right. I am keeping an eye on the chat. I haven't seen any more questions come in, but if folks have them, please go ahead and put them in.
Yeah. And I can inform you all that the maps, the CalSTART maps that you see on your screen, the link to that, it's a great map, great set of maps. You won't be disappointed.
Can I use this time that we're waiting for more questions just to answer? Eric had asked me about if there's other locations looking for photovoltaic noise barrier, and I forgot to mention, but Minnesota has a study about it, and they are also looking at snow fence to put the photovoltaic material on it. And there's also another project called the Ray. They're located in Georgia, and they also did a few years ago some studies with photovoltaic noise area. Oh, Ryan's back. Thank you.
Ryan, can you read us?
Looked like you froze up for a second and then
Yeah.
again.
Hey, these things happen. Oh.
I did see a comment coming from Amy Kaminsky from FHWA New Jersey Division saying you did so well. We don't have any questions. Thank you for that. If that changes and questions do come to mind, you can certainly reach out.
And sorry, everyone. I think we had some technical issues there. Just getting everyone's video and audio back.
Ryan, you still with us?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No, so sorry about that. I was just saying my screen cut out there for a little while. I think I had some technical issues, so I apologize for that. But we do still have time. I'm seeing that we don't have any questions at the moment. We can hang around for a few minutes now because we are a little early, if that's all right with everyone, to see if any questions come in. I will also remind everyone the recordings from this breakout session and from the research showcase will soon after the event be made available on the NJDOT Technology Transfer website. Additionally, those eligible to receive professional development hour credits will be receiving those by email after the event in the coming days as well. So with that, I want to say thank you to Chris, Leslie, and Al again. And maybe if it's okay with all of you, we'll hang out for a few more minutes to see if any questions come in. And I'm not seeing anything yet, so maybe go ahead and wrap up now. So I will say again, thank you, Chris, Al, and Leslie, for joining us and presenting today. And thank you to all of our attendees who joined us during this session. As was mentioned earlier in the morning, the other breakout sessions are happening concurrently. So if any are still going on, you can feel free to join those as well. So thank you all again and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.